I had a very weird, in fact, you know, one of the high water weirdness events of my life was when I was young. I used to, I wanted the DMT flash to last longer, so I used to smoke it at the height of LSD trips. And one Christmas vacation, this rooming house that I managed in Berkeley everybody had gone home for Christmas, I thought. And so I decided I would take some LSD and smoke DMT. And so I took the LSD and then I smoked the DMT. It was just nuts. I mean, it's nuts enough. But this was like turbocharged nuts. It went on and on and on. And finally, there was a woman who I rented a room to upstairs named Rosemary, who was supposed to be in Minnesota. And she was an actress and very projective and did everything with great flair. And she apparently came back early from Christmas vacation. So she hit the front steps running of this house and used her key to let herself into the front door and came right around to my door and started beating on my door. Well, I am by nature a very paranoid person. I mean, I can be up the Rio Yaguas Yasu in the middle of the Amazon basin, and if I'm out in the rainforest smoking a joint and a stick is broken anywhere near me, I immediately hide the dope, and just, I'm very paranoid. So this woman lets herself in and comes and beats with her clenched fist on my bedroom door. Well, I underwent a coronary thrombosis or something, and I was in the elf space, and they were screeching and chattering and showing me all this stuff. And when she did this, I flew off the bed. I jumped, I jumped 2 feet in the air and landed on my feet. And it was as though, and don't try this at home, folks. It was as though this sudden flash of adrenaline and this sudden movement that I made broke up the ordinary division between the trip and normality or something. Anyway, I pulled the trip with me into the room. I was now standing in the room, eyes open, but the elf creatures had come with me. And everything had just been jacked up to some immense level of intensity. And there were these rotating geometric things in the room, hanging in the air. And it was moving in this jerky motion. This thing was going click, 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 and it was faceted. And every time it would make this large metallic click, these plastic triangle-shaped, brightly colored chits or something, like little pieces of floor tile or something, would fly across the room. And each one of them had a letter on it in an alien language, sort of like Hebrew or Sanskrit. And it was just, there were several of these machines, and these things were ricocheting off the walls, and I had an elf hanging off each hand, and I was turning around, and I was just saying, holy shit! And then she's still beating on the door, So I stagger over to the door, fling it back, and look at her and say something like, "We dukwam waxi bogwadik haptikuputik." And then she realized at that point what my problem was and retreated. But I've never forgotten. It's the one time that they went literary on me, and not only did I see them, not only did I hear them, but they were printing on the air the message as well. Very curious. I mean, we don't, yeah. Yeah. It's... I don't know, the first few times I smoked DMT, I had almost no ability to say anything about it at all. I remember the first time I did it, I've never actually seen it hit anybody quite as hard as it hit me the first time. I came out of it and I said, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. And I said this about 200 times because I was blown out of the water. I'd spent years getting my act together and becoming a Marxist and a this and a that and had all this stuff all figured out, and it just left me absolutely intellectually naked. It was that everything you know is wrong experience, except that it was from the toes, I mean, everything I knew was wrong. I've never forgotten it. I mean, it is the most, I don't know, it's like hitting the reset button on your whole cosmogonic myth. I mean, it's the convincer. You occasionally meet people who say, you people who take drugs, listen, you think I believe that this is anything more than you just hyping yourself up on this? I say, listen, you got 10 minutes to put into exploring that point of view. Check this out, because it's confounding. I mean, people sometimes ask me, is it dangerous? It is if you fear death by astonishment. Astonishment is something we rarely experience as the genuine article. We fake it. Say, oh, you've really surprised me. But, hey, surprise, surprise, it can really get wrathy, yeah.
You mentioned this ancient cult that forbade the use of the mushroom. What were their beliefs? Why did they?
Mandaeanism? Well, Mandaeanism is a very old religion. It arose around Jerusalem in a couple of centuries before Christ. It was a baptismal cult. And I'm really into the Mandaeans, actually. They were the oldest continuous Western religion in the world with a Gnostic intent. And they started out as Jews, but they were persecuted. They claimed John the Baptist as one of their own. And he was a member of some kind of baptismal cult because we know he baptized Christ. But they were driven out of the area around Jerusalem, and then for centuries they were in Lebanon, and then they slowly made their way across Persia, and they ended up in the swamps of Iraq and Iran.
I know someone from there who calls himself a Baptist.
Do you? Is he from Basra? Is he from Basra, that city in the south? It's a very,
Still there. Yeah, there are about 1 million of them.
Why? How do you know?
You got some footage of that.
I heard about that footage. People in London told me that they had seen it.
Very underground, he told me that because they're discriminated against. You don't go around advertising that you are from these, the Muslims don't like them.
Oh no, they don't like them. Well, Mandaeans are very, very interesting. Yes, they have their own written language. Although in 1847 there was a cholera epidemic that wiped out 90% of the priesthood, and only priests were allowed to learn to read and write this language. I have some facsimile manuscripts from the Vatican Library. I sort of think that we all should become Mandaeans, that of all the religions I've ever looked at and studied, it seems to me the most psychedelic, the most sort of ethically correct. I mean, they are in there, and it would be a great religion to practice on a world scale because they're into caring for the land. They're river nuts. They love rivers, and they build a cult hut called a mandai, and they always divert a little ditch through it, and then they do their ritual baptisms and stuff like that there. But their folk tales and their religious beliefs are very interesting. It's like a religion of biology. The highest god in Mandaeanism is called Hibble-Zaiwa, and Hibble-Zaiwa is always referred to as they. So it's that they are in charge, and it's beautiful scriptural stuff. They're very much like Orthodox Jews, only more so, in that if you're a religious Mandaean, your life is ruled by all kinds of things, sort of like the rules of kosher. The most difficult rule that these people are asked to keep in their own lives is that if you're really a devout Mandaean, you are considered polluted if your eye falls on an unbeliever. And an unbeliever is a non-Mandaean. So you can imagine how difficult it is when you're down to 400 or 500 people to make sure that's the only people you ever see. The only profession that a Mandaean man can follow and not require ritual decontamination every day is silversmithing. So if you ever go to Baghdad, not likely too soon, but if you ever go to Baghdad or Basra or Kirkuk, there are communities of these people, and you find them by going to the silver markets. And then through discreet inquiry, you can find them.
You say they're highly psychedelic, but what about the mushroom? What's that all about?
Well, in folklore, folkloric anthropologists have developed all these rules. If a religion makes something taboo, you can usually bet that that means they were into it at some point. Because when a religion makes something taboo, it means that there has been a reformist upheaval inside the religion. This is probably how Soma was lost to the ancient Hindus, you know. It's how Zoroaster was called the Great Reformer. And he was the Great Reformer because he suppressed a lot of indigenous shamanic cults. And some people think that he actually attempted to suppress Hauma. And Hauma is the Avestan counterpart of Soma. If any of you are interested in all this book by Flattery and Schwartz called, what is it called? Hauma and Harmeline in Iranian Religion. It's from the University of California Press, and they make a very strong case that Soma was not mushrooms, that it was Pagaman Harmala. And it's a really interesting book. I mean, I learned things that I didn't know. For instance, in the pre-Zoroastrian phase of Iranian religion, drugs were not only used to access the spiritual world, but they actually said there was no other way to do it, which is sort of my position. So it was nice to know that these pre-Zoroastrian Iranian light religions, they were into what they called the Menog, M-E-N-O-G, the Menog, and it's another dimension. And you can only attain knowledge of it through the use of drugs. But the Menog existence is where the dead people are. And what their religion was about was you get to know your own soul through using drugs, and you approach it's like visiting somebody in stir. You go and your soul comes and meets you, comes through the Menog existence and meets you at the membrane. And the idea is that during life, you must learn to recognize your soul, because after death, if you can't pick it out of the soul swarm, then you will be somehow incompleted in the after-death world. Yeah.
You mentioned death by astonishment. What were you on, or what did you recommend?
To attain death by astonishment. Well, DMT raises the possibility of death by astonishment. I was talking to somebody about it last night, saying, when you take DMT, the question is not, will I be all right? The question is, have I lived through it or not? Because you can't tell whether you've lived through it. DMT is this very short-acting hallucinogen that you smoke, but it's a neurotransmitter. It occurs in all human beings on the natch, and it occurs in various plants and animals. In terms of nature, it's the commonest of all hallucinogens. In terms of impact, it's the strongest of all hallucinogens. I mean, it's a completely reality-obliterating experience, and it comes on so quickly that you don't grok it like a drug. I mean, we all know what a drug is. You feel this, you feel that, it gets stronger, it makes you rest, finally it overwhelms you. This isn't like that. This is like that, you and your friends are somewhere and there's talk about this drug and the pipe gets filled and this and that, and then you're about to smoke this drug, or maybe you just smoked it, but anyway, a 747 crashes into your apartment building at 3 times the speed of sound and interrupts whatever you were doing. And sometimes people come out of it saying, what happened? What happened? For crying out loud. Saying, nothing happened, you just did it. You mean that's it? Say, yeah, that's what it does. Because it's more like it happens so quickly that we interpret it as an event coming from the outside rather than a chemical compound diffusing through your body, because it completely replaces reality, not with the contents of your unconscious or your unfulfilled dream wishes or any of that, but with another dimension, a space filled with entities busy about their many tasks, although they notice you and come flocking over with a piercing screech and begin to, they like to treat with you, they play with you, they're not entirely friendly. It's sort of like, I don't know, it's the kind of feeling I used to have in India when I would go to make these hash buys in these Indian markets, and these guys would say, welcome, welcome, you're my friend, I am not like all the others. And what it was, we were there to do business, and so it was fine, and everything usually went smoothly, but this was no environment into which to let your guard down or anything like that. You've had your hand.
What does DMT do in our brain as a neurotransmitter?
We don't know. Nobody knows what it's doing there. And as long as the government makes it impossible for science to pursue rational questions or rational answers to these kinds of questions, it's not likely we'll ever find out. The best guess so far is that it mediates attention. That, for instance, if there were to be a noise over here or movement, and I turn and that's a little spike of DMT makes that possible. It's where you suddenly narrow your awareness and project it deeply into a small, confined area. This was the best guess of the people who did work on it a few years ago. Yeah. There are a number of physioactive tryptamines. DMT is not, if it's made right, not a cardioactive tryptamine. Sometimes when you smoke it, your heart races, but you can't tell whether that's sloppy synthesis or that you're scared. It's made from tryptophan. which is an amino acid, one of the 8 essential amino acids, and it's an easy conversion out of tryptophan.
But this one comes from a plant.
Well, it can come from a plant, but if you were to ask a chemist to make it for you, he'd ask you to get him a few hundred grams of tryptophan.
Can you, and do you distinguish between the kinds of entities that you encounter on DMT as against the kind that you encounter on mushrooms?
Well, on mushrooms, you hear a voice. You don't rarely, at least in my experience, do you see who's talking. But on DMT, all barriers are transcended in the first 30 seconds. I mean, you hear it, you see it, and sometimes you feel it, you know. These little entities, these self-dribbling basketballs, these things that I call the tykes, they jump into your chest. They jump into your chest, and then they jump out again. I don't know why they do that. In the Amazon, among the tribes that use DMT derived from plants, they call these spirit things, they call them hikuli. And they say that you're supposed to that they will jump into your chest, and then you're supposed to have a technique to keep them from getting out. And the number of these things that you trap inside your body cavity indicates how powerful a shaman you are. Your magic is done through the hikulis that are trapped inside of you.
So you really don't ever see those mushrooms?
You do, but it's fleeting. It's like, you know, it's different. With DMT, it is more real than this experience of sitting in this room is real. I mean, it is confounding. It's very hard on DMT to tell yourself this is a drug. I mean, good Lord, it doesn't seem like it. It seems like you just tunneled through an energy barrier into the beta sub X dimension, which is all the time all around us, but somehow you just became virtual and moved across the energy barrier, and there you are. You know, and the other thing about DMT that's weird is it does not affect your mind. In other words, you don't feel gaga with ecstasy. You don't feel relaxed. You feel exactly the way you felt before you did it. It's that the world has just been swapped out. And that's strange. I sort of like that it doesn't lay a glove on the observing cognitive processes. Instead, it just does something in the visual cortex that causes the world to be replaced by a 3, 4, 5-dimensional, highly colored, moving environment filled with screaming elf demons.
And are you talking about smoking your grandmother?
Oh, no. No. More like 50 milligrams. We need to go to lunch. This is the last clip.
I heard somewhere that concomitant use of MAO inhibitors increases the length of time that the DMT experience will last. Have you heard that? And if so, in what form are the MAO inhibitors taken?
Okay, the question is that can you extend the life of a DMT flash if you predose yourself with MAO inhibitors? The answer is probably. This is really a don't try this at home, folks, maneuver unless you really know your MAO inhibitors. There are MAO inhibitors, synthetics, that will inhibit every molecule of MAO in your body for up to 6 weeks after a single exposure. This you don't need. An excellent MAO inhibitor for these purposes would be harmine or harmaline, which is reversible in 4 to 6 hours. So if you take harmine and predose it, but before you go extending your DMT trip with an MAO inhibitor, you better have just an ordinary, old-fashioned, regular DMT trip and decide whether you really want to spend more time in that place. Because, see, the hook is, especially for smart-ass straight types is you say, look, it only lasts 10 minutes, for crying out loud. You want to have all these opinions on this subject, but you're not willing to invest 10 minutes. So most people, certainly I said, I had taken LSD and all. I thought, 10 minutes, bring it on. We'll go out and have a beer afterwards. Well, it turns out that in a holographic universe, 10 minutes is indistinguishable from 50,000 years under the proper conditions. So we'll meet back here at 2:30. And it was in this atmosphere that the Hermetic books were produced and written down. The chief magical ritual of Hermeticism is the invocation, the ability to call stellar demons down into statues. And then these statues prophesy. And this is why Christianity it takes the Jewish aversion to idol worship and just raises it to a whole new level of intensity, because they were freaked out by this animating of statues with stellar demons thing that the Hermeticists were into. Yeah.
When you say animating statues, what really happened?
Well, this is a good question, you know. I mean, when you're reading a 1,500-year-old account of a magical invocation, if we are to believe them, what happened was, by singing certain songs, burning certain incense, and performing these rituals at certain times that were astrologically correct, they could cause these things called decans, which are zodiacal demons of some sort. There are 3 decans to each zodiacal sign. See, modern astrology has largely forgotten this. I mean, there are people who do decanic astrology, but you have to pay through the nose because, of course, this is a lost and dying art. But they would somehow be able to draw these decans down into the statue, and then they could extract knowledge from the statue. And this would lay the basis for these sympathetic magics, which were then later developed in the Renaissance. It's quite powerful, actually. This is why this book I recommended is so interesting, the one on Spiritual and Demonic Magic by Walker, because it shows you how, by you living a certain life, these Renaissance princes were incredibly wealthy. So you have a suite of apartments which overlook, the Plaza San Marco in Venice, and certain colors are prescribed that the walls be painted. You only wear certain kinds of robes made of certain materials. You perform your magical invocations at certain times of day, burning certain incenses. And they were big on fresh air and light. It isn't the dark image of magic that we get of, the stirring cauldron and the bat-faced familiar and all that. No, it's all about open air, light, wind blowing through, flowing silk robes. They were angelic magicians, is what they were. And they were evoking these things through the use of sigils, which are magical symbols. And then there became stress on magical alphabets. Enochian is one of these magical alphabets, or languages, rather. John Dee, remember I mentioned the whole 10-year episode with the show stone. Well, one of the subjects which these entities that Dee and Kelly were dealing with returned to again and again and again were the Enochian, this language, which they said was the true language that Abraham used to communicate with the angels. And it has a special alphabet, an alien alphabet. And there's even been published an Enochian dictionary of some 4,000 or 5,000 words. There was a very bizarre, this is just a footnote, but a very bizarre episode in the mid-1950s. There was a woman who was a kind of clairvoyant, and she was in contact with flying saucers. I mean, now everybody and their dog is in contact with flying saucers, but at that time it was fairly rare enough that she became an object of interest to the CIA. And at one point, she was in the CIA building in Langley, Virginia, and they were interviewing her, and she said, "Well, there's a flying saucer right outside the window." And these guys rushed to the window and looked, and there was some kind of thing in the sky, and she said, It's giving me a message for you, for this colonel." And the message was Affa, 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 A-F-F-A. So he wrote this down. Well, then I didn't read this. I looked it up. I had a hunch. Affa is the Enochian word for nothingness. Just more weirdness. Angelic languages, why do these DMT creatures, why are they so concerned with language? Not only language, but alphabet.